Good morning and good evening, I should say, to those of you joining from Asia. My name is Scott Morris. I'm a senior fellow at the Center for Global Development. I'm very pleased to be hosting this session this morning on Asia's economic outlook and policy responses under COVID-19. I'm particularly excited by our speakers, the three speakers we have to help us with this topic. I'm going to introduce each of them briefly, very briefly, and then we'll turn it over to them in alphabetical order to offer some brief remarks. We will then have a more informal discussion for the balance of the hour. That would include potentially questions from all of you in the audience, and let me just remind you how to submit your questions. You can do so by email at events@cgdev.org. You can tweet them at cgdev, hashtag CGDtalks, or you submit them on comments via YouTube. So please feel free to do that now, and we'll be taking a look at those submissions. So to help us with our topic this morning, as I said, three excellent speakers. Starting us off will be Chihoko Goto, who is well known here in Washington, D.C. as an Asia expert. She is Deputy Director for Geoeconomics and a Senior Associate for Northeast Asia at the Wilson Center. And I've asked Chihoko to help us with generally with the scene setter in terms of what the picture in Asia looks like, and then particularly focused on the trade effects of this crisis and the economic shock associated with it. We will then turn to JP Thea, who is the principal economist at the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, one of the new players in Asia. This institution, but certainly in its short lifetime, very prominent, and even in terms of response to this crisis. So we'll be eager to hear from JP both on the economic outlook as he sees it at the bank, and also what the bank's activities have looked like in response to the crisis. And then last but not least, Jiro Tominaga, who is Director of Strategy, Policy, and Business Process at the Asian Development Bank, not a new player in the region, in fact, a very long-standing development institution, and in the same respect as AIIB, both an important voice on economic outlook questions, economic analysis, but also critically as a source of development finance and activities in response to this crisis. So I think from both JP and Jiro, we will be eager to hear their institution's perspectives and their activities, including areas of coordination and collaboration in terms of responses to the crisis in the region. I should say, in thinking about broad characterizations of this topic, I struggled in the sense of can we really characterize an Asian response or the performance of Asia as a region? This is a remarkably diverse region, very, very different economies, countries, governance systems. And yet, from a Washington perspective, I have to say it is striking, and we've seen it in the reporting here, that the trajectory of the pandemic itself in Asia has looked quite different than it does here in the U.S., in North America generally, in Europe certainly. And that presents, frankly, a little bit of a mystery for us. Clearly there have been different policy responses between regions. But again, I think we have to acknowledge that Asia is itself a diverse region, and I think even policy responses have varied across countries. So I think we'll be eager to get into that a bit, and then to think more squarely about the economic effects of all this and economic policy responses in terms of mitigating this crisis. So with that, let me go directly to you, Chihoko. We'll turn it over to you, and then we'll proceed to the other speakers.
Great. Thank you very much for your kind introduction, and also thank you for inviting me here to speak on this very moving, rapidly evolving issue. It's exciting to be here with both JP and Jito. I know I've been given 7 minutes to give a broad overview of what's happening, which isn't a lot of time, but I thought perhaps I could focus on two things. What has this health crisis created in terms of new economic challenges? And what has this health crisis done to increase the existing vulnerabilities and increase existing economic challenges? So what are two of the biggest, what I think of as new economic challenges as a direct result of the pandemic? The first and most obvious one is the global economic shutdown simultaneously, and how quickly consumer demand for goods as well as services will recover. And what's interesting about Northeast Asia, which is where the region I focus mostly on when it comes to Asia, is that the region has never actually shut down completely in response to COVID. And we're already seeing various degrees of trying to return to a pre-COVID economy. And nevertheless, Taiwan, Japan, South Korea are all facing incredible challenges to their economy, not least in terms of their GDP projections. I also do want to add that COVID in these three governments has not disproportionately impacted any one particular ethnic group or income group, which is a very different phenomenon from what we see here in the United States or much of Europe. The second economic challenge that has been created by this pandemic is closing borders in response to a health crisis. But now we're at the stage of trying to reopen those borders. So as I just said, we are already seeing Northeast Asian countries trying to resume activity as normal and having various degrees of success in doing so. But neither Japan, nor Taiwan, nor South Korea have opened up their borders to other countries. And this is a particularly big stumbling block, not just on the economic front and for trade purposes. But remember, this is also not just opening borders to goods and services, but also opening up borders to people. And that will have a great impact on not just trade relations, but also on diplomatic and more broadly security relations moving forward. I should add that Japan is currently considering reopening its border to 4 countries that have had been able to have a better grasp of keeping COVID in check. And they are Australia, New Zealand, Thailand, and Vietnam. When we expect other countries to have similar relations of having a kind of bubble relationship where they have limited or select opening of borders, and that will have an impact on their longer-term strategic relationship with key allies and partners. So turning, though, to the second part, which is to say, what predated COVID and what has been exacerbated in terms of economic risks as a result of the pandemic. One is the intensification of U.S.-China rivalry, and particularly in trade. And I can go on about this a little bit in detail in the Q&A session. But we look, for instance, the disruption of the supply chain management system and Japan's response, for instance, to encourage Japanese companies to establish themselves back into Japan as part of the parcel to stimulate growth from the COVID pandemic. But of course, Japan's been trying to do that kind of repatriation, reshoring, so to speak, of industries even far before COVID. And this is a trend that other countries, most notably here in the United States, will be looking for in various degrees and taking on different types of policy measures to ensure that this reshoring takes place. That, of course, opens a new can of worms about the rise of economic nationalism and the balancing of resilience to ensuring competitiveness and effectiveness of supply chains. And then finally, when we talk about the economic challenges predating COVID that has only been exacerbated with this pandemic, is the rise of the power and influence of middle powers. We have seen a renewed interest in redefining what it is to be an effective government, and effective and equitable economic policies that would be the foundation of an effective government. The U.S.-China rivalry has, of course, been a divisive factor within Asia. There has been a balancing act that has been very difficult for Asian countries to side with the United States on the security front, whilst maintaining strong economic ties with China on the other. This will continue to move forward, but at the same time, what COVID has done, precisely because the middle countries, the middle powers, have been more successful in dealing with this COVID outbreak and containing it, there is greater international interest in learning about how they have been successful, and how that model of success does not necessarily come from either China or from the United States. And in turn, that kind of success could be translated into their voices being reflected in setting the agenda and the priorities on bigger economic issues such as trade, and in reorganizing the WTO, to redefining the G7 that President Trump has postponed until this autumn. So let me stop there for now.
Well, thank you, Shihoka. That was excellent. In fact, you give me the challenge, and there are about 10 different issues you've raised that I'd like to follow up on in the discussion. So we'll move on to JP Thea. And I should say both you and Jiro, and we'll allow you a bit more time, but just to give us a sense. So JP, you are in Beijing, which is where the AIB's headquarters are. Jiro is actually in Tokyo at the moment. The ADB headquarters in Manila. If you both could give us a little sense on the ground, particularly for our Washington office, of what the restrictions look like, what the personal experience is with pandemic lockdown in your locality. So, JP, let's turn to you now for that and your broader presentation.
Thank you, Scott, for giving me the chance to present the views. I also share the ground experience in Beijing. I thought that would be very helpful. When I came back from Singapore to Beijing in about middle of March, economy was visibly down and the restrictions were fairly severe, and most of our staff have to go through 2 weeks of home quarantine. But I'm happy to share that over the past few weekends, shopping, eating has really picked up in Beijing, of course with the precaution, with masks and with temperature taking. Domestic travel is coming back, so people are starting to book domestic holidays to places where because they cannot travel overseas, flights are starting to become full on a domestic level. Shihoko mentioned that borders are closed, but I understand from press releases that Beijing government is also looking into creating green lanes with several countries. So I'm happy to say this because China gives the rest of the world a data point of what normal looks like. With precaution, with more e-commerce, with more e-meetings, life gradually can get back to normal within a 3 to 6 months time frame. So that gives a lot of learning experience to the rest. I'm also happy to report that AIB moved to the new Beijing headquarters in Olympic Park just yesterday. So all these are again giving evidence that things are slowly returning to normal, with precautions, with abundance of caution. Let me quickly, if I may, let me quickly move to the economic situation that I see, right? So again, like Shihoko, my preamble is that there are so many things that are going on. It is hard to keep track, but let me just focus on 2 or 3 things that I think will be most important for the audience. Firstly, despite the big real economic shock to the real economy across the board in Asia, financial market pressure were actually less this time.
We seem
The
to
great
have lost
skills and we started to track
JP. You froze up on us.
the pressure. So,
We can ask you to go back and restart your remarks.
okay. So, are you hearing me okay?
Yeah, you're okay now. You froze for about 10 seconds.
Okay. Yeah. So despite the big shock to the real economy, so when we are tracking the financial markets in Asia are behaving surprisingly benignly. So if you look at the yields to maturity on government bonds, if you look at the currency pressure, they were all less this time round compared to 12 years ago, the great financial. That is remarkable given the state of the depth and the ferocity of the real economic shock. So that I actually give a lot of credit to the emergency action that the monetary authority, the Fed included, that the liquidity that they gave, it had a real positive spillover even to Asia itself. The relative stability in the financial market has prevented the worst of the scarring effects, I think, on the real economy. The second point I'd like to make is that the COVID-19 crisis has also exposed the big infrastructure gaps Asia faced in housing, in clean water, in public healthcare, in healthcare, and last but not least, the digital divide. So many people have written and analyzed these issues, but COVID-19 really sharpened the focus on the infrastructure gaps in all these sectors that I mentioned Asia is facing. And the silver lining is that I think there is a real desire when you speak to policymakers around Asia, a real desire to fix this, not only in the short term, but once the worst part of the healthcare crisis is over, to fix things like digital, to fix things like public healthcare. So I think that gives a great kind of policy platform to kickstart economy at the same time of fixing the long-term, making up for the long-term infrastructure gap. My third point is that there is going to be risk ahead. So I will just briefly highlight 2. Debt to GDP, debt levels across Asia, debt burdens is going to rise. Let's put it on the table. Let's be very clear. Our estimation is at least across the board on average, 10% increase, 10 percentage to GDP increase in debt to GDP. Now, actuate that after the financial crisis, everyone saw the increase in debt of around 10% to GDP. So we are seeing the same level of increase in debt compressed within 1 or 2 years. And that is also equivalent of Asia losing 2 years worth of public investments, because Asia invests around 5% of GDP in terms of infrastructure. 2 years worth of infra investment. This is precisely the kind of risk that Shihoko mentioned, which is the risk around supply chain, protectionism, and economic nationalism. And here is where I think the including AIB, can do a lot with soft and hard measures to help countries overcome to do more projects that are open, to help countries manage their debt profiles. This is where I think multilateralism and multilateral governance is very important. So I will pause here. I will, if there's opportunity, I will talk about AIIB's specific response to the crisis. Thank you very much, Scott.
Great, thank you. That also was excellent, JP. I should say for you and our viewers that we did cut off your video because we were having problems with the transmission, but we heard you just fine by audio. So you're still with us, and we'll come back to you by some combination of audio and video. Jiro, last but not least, Jiro Tominaga. So let's hear from you again briefly, if you want to characterize Tokyo/Manila in terms of on the ground, but then more generally ADB outlook and responses. Over to you, Jiro.
Thank you, Scott. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all. It's a great pleasure for me to be part of this panel. Thank you, Scott, and the CGD to organize this event that is on a very timely topic. So, yes, about Manila and then Tokyo, as you mentioned, Scott, that I came to Tokyo. I came here about the end of March. So when I left Manila, this community quarantine had already started. It was quite a strict quarantine. There were some checkpoints around the area communities that we lived in. It was getting a little harder for us to go across the checkpoint to go for a grocery and then others. And then towards the end of the stay that I was in Manila, I lived in condominium, but the condominium policy decided that we shouldn't leave our unit unless very essential things that you have to do. Part of that, for example, the grocery shopping and things of that nature. I understand now that hearing from the colleagues that I in ADB who are in Manila, I think that tightening is got a little bit stricter. Only one person can go at a time for grocery shopping, for example. You need a permit to stay outside. People cannot jog. So that's a nature. When I came to Japan, I was, and our whole family was a little bit surprised how relaxed the situation was in Tokyo. I think they had some numbers down at the low level, so they have some been able to manage the number quite well without also having that sort of forceful lockdown type of situation. I think in Japan they have lifted these restrictions and gradually going back to normal since I think last week, maybe towards the end of May. As far as Manila is concerned, they moved to from modified enhanced community quarantine to general community quarantine starting from 1st of June. But I think I don't think it is close to this type of situation that JP mentioned about Beijing. I think the three restrictions, the people coming in to the country through the airport, they all have to take the PCR test, and then they have to wait for a couple of days until the results come out in the government facility or the other hotels and that sort of thing. So there are still a lot of restrictions there in terms of people moving across. Also, I understand there are still the mobility limitation to some extent. So I think we'll see the transition to general community quarantine, how it is going to go, whether the infection rate number is going to go up or is stay at the manageable level. I think I'm looking very keenly to hopefully to see the number comes down fairly quickly, so that I'll be able to go back to Manila again quite soon. So that's the situation that I'm aware of. So for this initial intervention, I thought I would touch on two things, on the economic outlook and then also how organizations like us, ADB, can help. I will go over them fairly quickly, but of course we can come back to those issues in the Q&A session. Before just starting this session, let me just have a little bit of caveat that whatever that I say here are all the views of mine, so they do not represent the views of the ADB as such. So just wanted to make that point. So on the current economic outlook, let me make 3 points. First, I agree with all the points that I made so far. Also, a lot have been said by many, like IMF, the World Bank, and OECD. I think they vary in specifics, but and I agree with the overarching message. The situation is serious and outlook quite grim. As for ADB, we published in mid-May that potential economic impact in Asia and the Pacific will be about $1.7 to $2.5 trillion, which is 6.2 to 9.3% of the regional GDP. So the situation is serious, and so that's my first point. Second is that this could cause for us the concern is a significant setback in the impressive record of poverty reductions that we had in our region. Our estimates show that in the long containment scenario, which containment measures to continue for 6 months, could increase the $3.2 per day poverty rate by 4 percentage points, increasing the number of poor people by about 140 million people. And particularly the certain groups of population will likely be hit more severely. Unskilled and informal sector workers, women, girls, senior citizens, or the people with disabilities, by losing jobs, income, of course, and then the increased healthcare costs and so on. For women, also the unpaid care work would also increase, with children out of school, they're staying at home, and then also elevated care needs of elderly. And third, the longer the containment measures need to remain, the larger the impact. So rapid and effective containment will allow for a faster recovery. So in that sense, there is no trade-off between containment and economic recovery. I think the government should focus very much first on containing the pandemic, and then for that, I think the adequate testing, tracing, and isolation would be a key. It should also be complemented with income support to mitigate the negative economic impact, and consideration for optimal reopening strategy going forward. So now, what can institutions like us can do? As you know, various MDBs have announced their support packages. We did ours on April 13th, $20 billion package. I think I see primarily 4 areas where we can contribute. First is support for government containment measures. It would include support for urgent need to purchase and transport medical equipment, supplies, personal protective equipment, testing kits, ventilators. Actually, our initial support focused in this area, mostly through a grant program. I think our first support was as early as February 7th, and I think it was one of the earliest, if not the earliest, among the MDBs. So we also need to help strengthen, I think, the country's healthcare infrastructure. One of the things that this crisis has shown is that the country's healthcare infrastructure could be an important global and regional public goods, because weakness in one country, for example, containing a spread of virus, could have regional and global impact. The second is a private sector support, rejuvenating the disrupted trade and supply chains, supporting liquidity-starved SMEs. We're providing the support through trade finance, supply chain finance, and microfinance, and through non-sovereign loans and guarantees. And third is a big area is the government's countercyclical spending programs. The government across Asia have generally acted very rapidly, and some with very positive outcomes, I think, in containing the pandemic. But they're also taking proactive counter-cyclical fiscal actions, particularly through direct income or revenue support of households and business and public sector organizations. We think it's important to support government in these efforts. This is not only because many governments are facing huge fiscal pressure, which is true, but also because we think it makes sense. According to our estimate, at least, these measures could reduce the COVID-19 negative impact by as much as 30 to 40%. So in our 20 billion support package, we established what we call the COVID-19 pandemic response option, CPRO. It's a budget support instrument to help governments counter cyclical expenditure program with a particular focus on the poor and the vulnerables. And the demand has been so far has been quite high. We have approved 9 CPROs already since the time that we announced it in mid-April. So finally, very important is the knowledge support, I think. Support through our research and public policy dialogue would be very useful to help countries target their policies, including for the steps towards reopening strategies, post-crisis recovery phase, opening the border, and these kind of things, right? So as one of the efforts, ADB has been updating their assessment of the economic impact periodically. We will issue our next one in the end of June. The next update, we expect that will include the growth forecast. Previous one in April was done when the global COVID cases were around 500,000. Today, the number has exceeded 6 million. So I think it is time to update it. I want to emphasize that we need to ensure development partner coordination to join force and avoid duplications. We are working closely with IMF and the World Bank. We also have close collaboration with organizations like including UN agencies, particularly in the procurement and delivery of medical supplies and equipment, as we face global shortage in the supply of these goods. Cofinancing is also going to be an important way to scale up our support. And then let me note that we're working with AIIB on this front as well. So let me stop here and then happy to answer questions. Thank you very much, and back to you, Scott.
Great. Thank you, Jiro. And again, thank you to all three of you for excellent presentations. Let me start in following up one of the issues that Shihoko led with, and all of you, frankly, have addressed, which is thinking about the distributional effects of the crisis, and in two ways, I would say, within the countries in the region. So, as Shihoko noted, for Northeast Asia, in fact, you have fairly uniform effects, which would represent a good outcome, frankly, because in contrast, if we think about, for example, here in the U.S., it's already coming to light, and it's very disturbing to see the concentrated effects of this pandemic on certain populations, on minority populations, lower income. And so I'd like to understand better how that looks for Asian countries, what it either implies or what it requires in terms of government responses, in terms of how they perform to date, and then also your institutions, the ADB and AIIB. How do you think about, Jiro, you just referred to targeting even the budget support you provide to lower income populations. So I'd like to understand that better as an agenda. And then also thinking across countries, that we can think of distribution. Again, it's a diverse region. You have wealthier economies. You also have within the region some of the poorest economies in the world, even for what is broadly understood to be a wealthier region in the global economy. So if you could also address particularly how your two MDBs are thinking about the varying needs across your client countries, whether it's a low income country or a much bigger emerging market economy. So maybe Shihoko, do you want to start and just maybe elaborate a bit more on the point you made in terms of the countries you had focused on? What are they doing right, and would you characterize it that way on this issue? Unmute, please.
In terms of demographics, unlike Europe or here in the United States, the industrialized East Asia really hasn't had the kind of demographic diversity in terms of ethnicity. And so it is easier to put that aside. What is interesting, though, is these societies are rapidly aging. 25% of the Japanese population is over the age of 65, which is supposed to be this particularly vulnerable demographic. And yes, we have seen a higher rate of death in the older population. But when we look at the cluster and we look at how the contagion clusters spread, it's actually not necessarily simply in nursing homes or where older people are congregating. It's also in places where there are pockets of concentrated gatherings in enclosed spaces. And I think one of the things that Japan has done really well is to make the message of what the dangers of contagion are. And they're called the 3 C's. And I can't remember exactly what the 3 C's stand for in English, but it's like enclosed space, concentrated population, and Gio's going to help me out here. Concentrated space, and so there is this consensus about the danger is not isolated to a particular group, that everyone is vulnerable, and that there are steps that can be taken, and indeed people are taking it. And I want to point out before I turn over to the others, is that this has not led to a crisis of leadership. So we look, for instance, at Korea, which actually had an election in the midst of a pandemic. And the fact that they were able to move ahead with that, and the fact that President Moon Jae-in was actually seen as a very effective leader in containing the virus, and also being an example to the world as to have a very data-rich, IT-dependent approach to keeping the spread in check. That has actually catapulted his political power as well. And when we look, for instance, at Taiwan, the Taiwanese elections had occurred earlier in the year, but President Tsai was inaugurated last month, and her support between her re-election and her re-inauguration has actually surged as a result of keeping track of COVID, in spite of the fact that Taiwan, amongst all governments, has a very close physical relationship with mainland China as well. So these are some of it has led to a political strengthening and a renewed faith in governance as well, because it is seen as a virus that spreads equally and that no one is immune.
Great, thanks. And JP and Jiro, similar question to you on sort of the impact of the crisis on distributionally on different populations, and again across your countries of operation. It must look very different in terms of your bank's responses to a low-income economy versus one of the emerging market economies. So, and JP, you mentioned the degree to which the crisis has revealed what we know to be public infrastructure gaps, and thinking about distributional effects there as well. So if either one of you want to come in on that question.
I can say something. So Scott, I think you asked an excellent question, right? So I think the pandemic, the spillover on the economy, the shutdown, all these have exposed different societies, rich or poor, in different ways, and on distribution. Maybe in the US, it's the death rate between black and white citizens. But in Asia, let me share with you a few things. I think it has exposed the divide between those who can social distance in their own house versus those who live in very cramped kind of informal housing and bad living condition. That is one divide. I think it has also exposed a divide between those who are able to have digital access and continue to work from home or continue to school from home, and those who do not have even nowhere near a computer, nowhere near broadband. I think it has exposed also a divide between the migrant workers part of the economy versus those who are in the more formal sectors who are able to get better access to healthcare. So one example will be in my home country in Singapore. So the infection rate between the local population and the migrant quotas, migrant worker population is very, very different. And Singapore government is also trying to remedy or put in place policies to adjust for that. So it has also exposed a divide between countries of those governments who have the fiscal and borrowing capacity to do a lot of counter-cyclical kind of support or give unemployment benefits, versus those who are unable to because of no market access, borrowing costs are super high, and already in a fiscal poor shape to respond. A lot of these things will require long-term structural kind of policies. It will not be, you cannot overcome these kind of big divides just by very short-term measures. In AIIB, we also recognize that we have to do a lot of such short-term measures, even though it is going to be imperfect. So one of the things that we did was to create these crisis recovery facilities. Under the crisis recovery facilities, we'll cover emergency healthcare, helping companies, helping economies stay afloat through working capital, etc. And unprecedented is our policy-based and budget-based lending. So Scott, an audience, you will know that AIB typically only lends to infrastructure. But in this new facility, we will now work with ADB, work with EBRD, work with World Bank to provide kind of policy and budget support. And some of the budget support may allow the government to do things like provide unemployment benefits in the 3 to 6 months that the economy has to shut down. So this is really new for us. So we have put aside about 10 billion to do this. Will it be able to solve all the divides that you mentioned? Probably not. But hopefully, working with other MDBs and international community, we can help countries put in place a package to allow them to tide through the short-term counter-cyclical budget needs and these various emergency measures, ameliorate most of the worst of the divides, and then, when the crisis is over, turn around to fix the long-term infrastructure on housing, water, digital, that hopefully in the long run will make the future pandemics or future kind of crisis easier to manage. Thank you.
So, yes, thank you. Let me just come in on this one. I fully agree with what JP just mentioned about several divides that this crisis is demonstrating, and social distancing, digital divide, and then migrant workers, which is also in the Philippines. There are a lot of overseas Filipino workers coming back and then staying there. Also, one of the benefits of having a headquarters and office in one of the developing countries like in the Philippines is that you can really see the difference, right? I mean, the community and area where the social distances can be done, or you can hire somebody to do the delivery for the food and other services. On the other hand, some urban environment where the people just don't have any choice, but they have to live in a very sort of closed area. So, I mean, we also certainly worry about the social distancing whether it is being enforced. Also about the daily labor wages is going to be gone. For example, jeepneys, for example, are not operating. For example, so the jeepney owners and drivers, and just sort of there are a lot of sort of examples that you can see. It's so visible to us that the impact of this containment measures and lockdown have on these communities. I think the countries you talked about the across the region, how they're different. I think to the extent that we are seeing, of course, I don't know the situation in all the countries, but there are a lot of countries who are very, very aware of this issue, and then having their effort in their counter-cyclical support program, including cash transfer type of program, or the support to the small and medium enterprises, working capital, but also at the same time helping them in other means. So that seems to be very well accepted, one of the measures that the government seems to be taking, and which is good. As I mentioned in my initial talk, that in the counter-cyclical support programs in the Asia and Pacific region, I think our estimates show that about 40% of their support packages are actually the cash transfers and then revenue transfers for this thing. So I think they're very much aware of the need for this. And I think, and then also the countries with the existing social protection program, the conditional cash transfer and others, Philippines included, and there are also other countries, they are making use of this program very effectively so that they can provide liquidity to those poor households very quickly. So I think that's a good sort of policies that we want to support in our programs. The one issue I think is that because of these fiscal needs, of course, JP mentioned in his initial intervention about the debt situation. Of course, there's going to be a medium-term issues that we will have to think about. But I think in a sense that to me, it looks like it is something that we need to do for the short term. And then think about a structural measure for the debt in the medium term for our policy. Keep it for the policy questions for the medium term. Thanks.
Great, thank you. So let me, I have a very brief sort of follow-on question in this area, and then I want to shift to talking more directly about trade. But in terms of the follow-up, we had a related question come in, and a number of you did talk about the effect on migrant population, and we know, there's a remittance effect that we can see if migrant workers aren't working, they can't send money home. But I'm curious if any of you want to talk about the border restrictions, basically, with the necessary restrictions on movement because of the pandemic. It is a policy question how those are unwound and how effectively and how coordinated. So I wonder within the region if there's anything you can characterize in terms of how the governments are talking to each other about the pace of winding down, or whether it's on a bilateral basis, some kind of multilateral. It just seems like there are considerable risks going forward that this won't be done in an orderly way, and will have a particular effect certainly on populations, including migrant workers, but it certainly has an effect on the broader trade relationship. So is there anything you could point to that sort of suggests useful cooperation around this question? Recognizing each country has to take decisions in the interest of its citizens and effectively combating the pandemic. Anyone?
I think JP may be more knowledgeable about this. Oh, sorry, sure, go ahead, please, sorry.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment rather than really answering your question. I think whatever happens on this issue, it'll be interesting to see the role the United States may or may not play, given the fact that it does have the highest infection as well as the death rate on the one hand, and yet it remains the economic powerhouse to date, and it'll be very difficult for countries to make a decision when it comes to its stance in reopening borders, re-engaging with the United States.
JP, we have you by audio. I don't know if you wanted to come in on this.
Yeah. So Scott, I have to confess that we do not have special information on whether or not the borders is going to open. So we are not, MDBs typically are not involved in that part of the conversation. But just some observations as an analyst, right? So the different countries have different strategies. So I think of all the kind of strategies that I've seen, maybe the one that I like best as a person is I like Germany a lot. So they managed to bring infection rate down to a manageable level, but not zero. And they have to an open EU has started to have gradually ease on cross-border restrictions. So my own personal sense is that trying to open the borders mutually only when both sides reach zero, the pain and the economic cost on trade, on migration is too high. But trying to open when both are having a very high rate of infection and there isn't a very effective medical treatment, the pain and the disruption, it may also be very high, and the mutual distrust, mutual infection and distrust may be very high. So I kind of lean towards the European model. Bring it down to a manageable level, not zero, and from then onwards start to open the border as long as the infection rate is under control, reproduction rate is below 1, I think it's a good time to have a proper kind of measures at the border. The one thing that I am very heartened about is that trade has not been severely disrupted. Yes, of course, there is a demand effect. Yes, of course, there's a supply chain effect. But in the initial days of the virus, right, Scott, actually we were very worried about food security. So gradually, I think that kind of supply chain on food and on various other things have proven to be more resilient, and trade essential goods are still flowing, even though it's hard to get people across the border. That I think is actually what I consider silver lining to keep at least the trade part, the goods part is still moving. Thank you.
Maybe, Scott, can I just come in really quick on this thing? Well, it's not necessarily about the border closure issue specifically, but I think generally speaking that there are some consideration that for transition from a very hard containment measure into the next phase of sort of smarter reopening or smarter lockdown measures, right? So I think there should be some kind of a consideration based on the essentiality of the particular sort of industries or service sectors. For example, healthcare services and all these things, it needs to be essential that is functioning even in a crisis situation. And at the same, also, I mean, there need to be some kind of consideration of the economic impact of it, how many people are being hired, all that sort of things, and how big the economy is compared to the GDP. And then also in consideration of the risk factor. So they could also include the more sort of epidemiological sort of consideration into the economic policy. So all these things need to be integrated together to come up with some smarter measures. And then I think for that sort of thing, MDBs may be able to help on the collecting information and some also doing some analysis on what kind of measure and the policy sequencing may be possible and optimal for a given country. Thanks.
Great, thank you. And so with a little bit of the segue that JP provided, I do want to ask a question directly about trade, but more specifically trade policy. And in the way that Chihoko had teed it up earlier, that obviously there's a potential or the reality of a trade shock here from the economic effects of the crisis. But then I think going forward, there are real questions about how governments are going to respond generally with their trade agendas. So Chihoko mentioned the onshoring drive. We're seeing it here in the U.S. You characterize it in Japan. We had a question come in about China's relationship with the region. So let me integrate that into a question about trade. How do you see this? And I suspect the two of you at the MDBs are a bit constrained in how much you want to characterize the politics here. Nonetheless, I mean, even if we think of the role of your institutions broadly over the years, it has sort of been to espouse trade liberalization, trade integration, along with sort of appropriate attendant policies. But, if nothing else, certainly the picture has gotten more complex with things like greater sensitivities to supply chains. So what does the trade policy agenda look like going forward? What are the risks Are there sort of parameters on what is sensible in the way of adjustments? And then within the region in particular, China and all the other countries, what does the trade relationship look like going forward? Not an easy set of questions, but whoever wants to come in first.
Okay, let me.
I can.
Yeah.
Sure.
Oh, just one thing. There had initially been a lot of concern about the export restrictions. So this time last year, we talked that trade relations was one of the biggest economic risks to the global economy. We're not talking about tariffs anymore. The risk at the initial stage of COVID outbreak was about export restrictions, most notably in the medical sector, in providing pharmaceuticals and providing the necessary equipment. That has abated to some extent, and we also saw some countries impose food export restrictions as well, and that has abated somewhat. However, it becomes a question of pricing. The availability of the necessary equipment, the products, will be to the highest bidder. And this will be particularly true when there is a vaccine or even a cure to this particular virus. The highest bidder will be able to access that. What kind of policies can we take to ensure that this becomes a global good? That there is equal access. And I think that's where the true strength of international cooperation and the influence that multilateral institutions, including international financial institutions, will have.
JP?
Scott? Yeah. So it is very clear where MDBs will stand on this, right? So in our Articles of Agreement, we are set up to promote international cooperation. That is written into our charter. So it is our mandate. The second thing that in our policy, we only provide finance when we are assured that the financing, whether to the productive sector or to the sector, is economically sustainable. If because of protectionism, because of trade restrictions, and because of this kind of economic kind of national rules and nationalism, right? So if it makes the sector productive only behind tariff walls, it makes it very difficult for MDBs to provide finance, because we want to make sure that the assets that we are financing is fundamentally sustainable and good for the country in the long term. And the third thing is that, if you know from our MDB rules, when it comes to procurement, when it comes to sovereign financing, we will always require open kind of a procurement rules. That in itself will makes it uncomfortable, will sit very uncomfortably with very protectionist kind of things for project financing. So whether from the broad mandate to the specific policy on procurement, to the specific policy of ensuring economic sustainability of the financing itself. So we definitely will not fund projects that are against this kind of very fundamental principles and policies that are in place. I agree with Shihoko that the trade export restrictions have abated somewhat. Hopefully this is the trend and a sustained trend. And hopefully when the new infrastructure stimulus bills that country put out, which I think is necessary, will also be designed well enough and designed robustly enough, and not to contain too much of this kind of unnecessary distortion through trade or through other measures. So this is something that MDBs have a responsibility to maintain international collaborations and also to ensure economic sustainability fundamentally itself. Thank you.
Jiro, that was, I think JP gave a forceful statement of the MDB position. I'm going to give you the last word to either agree or augment.
Well, just very briefly, liberal trade regime has been a very important part of Asia's development and growth, and then we think that is very important. While also recognizing there are a lot of different dynamics working on in this discussion. But yes, I agree with JP that we are always towards the liberal, keeping the liberal trade regime in the region and as a global system. Thanks.
Okay, well, listen, in normal times, this would be the part of the session where I ask the audience to give all of you a round of applause. They're welcome to do that at home. Unfortunately, you won't hear it, but Chihoko, JP, and Jiro, thank you very much. This was certainly for me an enlightening conversation. I hope at the center we'll be able to do more in the way of focus on Asia in the months ahead, and look forward to talking to you all again soon. Thank you again.
Thank you for hosting
so
us, and thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.